take turns. It's only gonna take me like one turn to like wreck this shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, all right. Fine. So Jon's been talking about this for like the past week. He's been talking about how the conflict just boils down to the Palestinians being an honor culture and the Israelis having a superior dignity culture, and those cultural differences best explain the conflict. What I'm going to appeal to for an explanation is more around the political decisions around the conflict and the empirical evidence that we actually have on the ground of how each side is behaving when it comes to discussing this conflict. So we can talk back to, I mean, the establishment of Israel. It was a project funded. It was a project basically ran by the British while they occupied the territories. Between 1917 and 1947, the British intended to build a Jewish state in that area. Upon the declaration of the Jewish state under the 1947 partition plan, it was UN Resolution 181 that called for a division. War broke out between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Palestinians were angered by the British mandate because, what's it called? Yeah, basically because it denied the Palestinians access to key air and seaports, and it also led to the occupation of many Palestinian villages. Right, that's why Palestinians, denied that resolution. Post-1947, Zionist paramilitary groups began a process of ethnic cleansing in the form of large-scale attacks, massacres, and destructions of entire Palestinian villages to build the Jewish state. By 1949, the Jewish state had taken up 78% of historic Palestine. The international community chose to recognize Israel, according to its borders in 1948. So at this point in time, when we're talking about the land between the Jordanian border and the Mediterranean Sea, the Palestinians had roughly 45% of the land, and the Israelis had roughly 55% of the land. 20 years later, the Arab-Israeli War broke out in 1967. Israel militarily occupied almost the entirety of the historic Palestine, consisting of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. Israel also occupied the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt and the Golan Heights in Syria. With the exception of the Sinai Peninsula, all of these territories remain occupied until today. Egypt got the Sinai Peninsula back in 1967. So in response to that, the UN voted unanimously, almost, on Resolution 242, exactly 50 years ago. Well, not exactly, but roughly, sorry. So the resolution stated that Israel had to withdraw from all the occupied territories seized during the war, ensuring diplomatic relations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The entirety of the UN accepted this resolution. The PLO accepted the resolution, and this is the basis for the trading land for peace deal that the UN brokered. So shortly after the war, Israel, in further violation of international law, annexed East Jerusalem and declared it its eternal, undivided capital, right? This annexation of East Jerusalem is viewed by the international community and virtually every nation on earth as occupation of illegal territory, with the exception of the United States and Israel. Until this day, Israel continues to violate international law through the expansion of the settlement project. Over the last 50 years, roughly 600 to 750,000 Jewish Israelis were moved from the West Bank to the West Bank and East Jerusalem. They live on roughly 160 settlements. Further to Israel expanding the illegal settlement project, the current Likud government offering financial incentive for Israelis to move from parts of Israel that are legally Israeli to these illegal settlements, right? This happens to this day. They provide financial incentives to do this. And that means roughly 11% of Israel's 6.6 million Jewish population lives on illegally occupied land, according to the United Nations, in the vast majority of the world. To add further insult to injury, the Gaza Strip, one of the most contested regions in the world, is regularly subject to human rights violations. Among these, right, are the use of white phosphorus on civilian lands. The most commonly cited case of this is between December 27, 2008 and January 18, 2009. It's called Operation Cast Lead, where for 22 days Israel bombarded the Gaza Strip with white phosphorus. You know, and this is the Human Rights Watch actually did an extensive report on this, showing that it was a clear and open violation of international law. So that's basically the gist of it. If you look at all the evidence on the ground, the fact that 11% of Israelis live on illegal settlements, the fact that Israel continues to expand the illegal settlement project, and the fact that Israel uses weapons illegal under Geneva Conventions on these territories, I don't understand how anyone can sit here and say that this is because the Palestinians have a culture that is not, the Israelis have a superior culture to the Palestinians. This is obviously a result of Israeli aggression on these lands. But go ahead.
Yeah, that last statement there, my opponent said the words obviously. That's just ridiculous. It's not obvious at all why this is taking place. And another thing, if you go into like the bot commands, I posted 2 charts. Those explain the Israeli culture, for lack of better words, and the Muslim culture, right? Like the honor culture is obviously the culture that Islam produces. I mean, if Sam wants to challenge that, then he can do so now. But is that something you're going to want to challenge?
When you say Islam produces honor cultures, is that necessarily the case?
There's always going to be like what I like to call progressive Muslims, Muslims who go against the word of Muhammad. They're not real Muslims, dude. There's always going to be these outliers, right? But generally speaking, hundreds of millions of Muslims hold views that are incompatible with dignity cultures, which would be the cultures that Christianity and Jewish people subscribe to. I've been trying to explain to you that when it comes to like discussing why it is we see conflict amongst the Jews and the Palestinians, I don't understand. I think your fundamental issue is that you're not willing to accept to what degree, the massive degree evolutionary biology explains the conflict. Well, you want to see things like socio-economical reasons are more influential in the conflict, which is a claim you cannot back up, in my opinion.
Well, actually, I do have reason to contest the fact that Islam will tend to produce honor cultures, but I want you to finish, actually. I want to give you the amount of time I had. So go ahead and finish, and I'll address it afterward.
Yeah, so I'm just going to repeat it. I think there's a fundamental issue with your reasoning, and it's that you're placing too much credence on socio-economical factors in terms of explaining the conflict with the Jews and the Palestinians, right? Like I'm explaining to you that we can drop all the socio-economic factors. Like everything you're saying is true. Like, you know, the Jews do this, the Jews do that. But I'm trying to explain to you that there is a war of ideas, and what side of this war are you on, Sam? You are going to, in other words, I'm trying to explain to you that there isn't an honor culture you want to live in, right? Because you've adopted Western values, you subscribe to dignity cultures, but your Muslim brothers and sisters do not. Your Muslim brothers and sisters are peddling and pushing an honor culture. Is this something you disagree with?
In principle, yeah, I would. I think we can see. I think we can see evidence today of Muslim societies that exist in what you would classify as a dignity culture, and we can see enough evidence of the contrary. Like, I just don't think it's a necessary entailment.
Can you give me one example?
Okay, I mean, if we characterize dignity cultures, right, as cultures that provide law, order, and rights to all citizens, and as to have a value over the rule of law, over just like the status of the individual. Yeah, I can show you numerous examples where I think that'd be the case. One example would be like the United Arab Emirates or the rich Gulf states in the Middle East, right? Another example might be...
I don't think you know what an honor culture is. Like, just go to the bot commands, look at that white chart. It says honor culture. Look at all of those characteristics, and look at the very bottom, and it explains what the necessities, right? What do you call it? The necessary prerequisites or some shit. In other words,
yeah, I've glanced over it, and a key element, right, of that is the state guaranteeing rights to all citizens, and what's it called? A focus on authority rather than kind of like macho kind of brevity almost, right? But I can tell you, right, I lived in the UAE for 4 years, and we could provide empirical evidence for this. But the United Arab Emirates is one Muslim state that I would not say has the primary characteristics of an honor culture, right? In the United Arab Emirates, it isn't the case that, you know, physical bravery and violence prevail, right? And I'm reading right through the list. In the United Arab Emirates, it isn't the case that people have a willingness to dominate one another, right? It isn't the case that people are expected to engage in violent retaliation to resolve their problems, right? There's a system of law that's adopted by.
Then it's not an honor culture,
right, and that's an example of one Muslim society that isn't, right? Do you think that? Go ahead.
Well, I think the main point I'm trying to get at is like human rights and things like that. Like when I say things like there's a war of ideas, these cultures are clashing. Like understand that honor cultures and dignity cultures coexist everywhere in America. For example, in all the ghettos where there's lack of law and order and things like that, these are all honor cultures being played out, where social status is of the utmost importance in terms of your survival. So, like, these things can coexist, Sam. But the main point is we're talking about value. We're talking about human values, right? We're talking about hundreds of millions of Muslims having values that are incompatible with what me and you subscribe to, all right? Like, as people who subscribe to dignity cultures. Like, me and you have certain, like, you know, views on homosexuals and fucking on women that a lot of Muslims don't hold. Well, so there's a war of ideas here. And, I think on your side is a lack, you're failing to acknowledge which side of this war of ideas you stand
I think, what's it called? Jonjon, I think you're straying off the topic, right? The thing where you were meant to be discussing here, right, is to provide some kind of explanation for an account of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? And to provide an account that offers more explanatory power than mine, right? So I cited political decisions. I can post those sightings, but I talked about political decisions, and I talked about empirical evidence for why this is an ongoing conflict. I talked about the actions specifically that Israel is taking.
This is just going to be considered your turn to talk. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I cited evidence specific pertaining to the conflict, pertaining to how Israel is expanding the settlement project, pertaining to how the British mandate affected the region. You're supposed to be providing an account for this conflict, right? You're not supposed to be reading the phone book here.
Is it my turn?
Yes.
All right. So the explanation that I put forth, I'm asserting that my opponent is making a claim here that he's probably not willing to acknowledge, but he's making the claim that the socio-economical factors are more explanatory than the evolutionary-based factors. Now, I'm putting forth the evolutionary-based factors that Islam produces honor cultures, which are absolutely incompatible with the dignity cultures, our modern cultures, like what Christianity puts out, what the Jews are living. So the Jews are in the right here. Like, we are all on the Jew sides. We are all on Israel's side in terms of our values. We don't want the Muslims to take over and enforce their Sharia law and honor cultures and shit. And I did like, my whole argument, the thing I want people to take away from this discussion is that evolutionary biology has more explanatory value than what you people are letting off. That we can actually explain things like conflict between two cultures on an evolutionary scale, right? We don't have to sit here and argue for hours and hours about, you know, political factors here. But I can keep going. I mean, go ahead if you want to cut me off.
Well, like I said, I just think that if somebody was trying to understand the conflict, they would appeal to the kinds of evidence that I brought forward, right? And one explanatory power, or one thing that the evidence can explain, right, is the current tensions, right? So if we look at what periods of time were the most tense in the region, right, it is the time, when the British decided to divide the land. It is the time while Israel is providing financial incentive to expand the illegal settlement project on the West Bank. It is the time when they used weapons illegal under the conventions of war on these settlements, right? So all I'm trying to say is that, and another thing, when you keep appealing to Islam producing honor cultures, right? I already showed you there are a lot of examples that we can point to at the opposite. There are a lot of Muslim nations today that wouldn't exhibit the primary characteristics of an honor culture. What seems to be the case, what seems to be producing honor cultures are socioeconomic factors, right? What seem to be producing honor cultures are things like Are things like political instability.
Can I challenge you? Can I step in and challenge that?
Go ahead.
Well, you say that once again, you're just putting forth that it's more socio-economical. Well, I disagree with you. I think that this is more of a fundamental belief system. These are fundamental belief systems clashing, Sam. It's much more fundamental than politics. Like, ideas are selected for on an evolutionary scale. We call these things religion. These things evolve because they are useful to us. So, like, these are absolutely thought processes that have evolved clashing with one another, right? So if we have two cultures in the same place at the same time that are incompatible with one another, how does this not explain the conflict?
Well, one piece of evidence that I can cite why it doesn't explain the conflict, right, is that Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in historic Palestine with relative peace for a certain time period, right? Before the British Mandate in 1948, there were still Jews that lived in historic Palestine, right? Jews and Muslims attended the same schools. Jews and Muslims went to the same hospitals, lived in similar neighborhoods, right? Well, if they're called, hold on, if they're called,
because moral relativism wasn't as powerful back then. So you're mistaken on how things exactly were back then. We see it now, even in modern society, where countries like let's take Europe for example, they're backtracking and becoming anti-moral relativistic in terms of banning burqas and things like that, because they've realized that they have to be able to stand up for their own values. They have to be able to be like nationalists, in other words. They can't be multicultural with this culture that's incompatible. So they have backtracked, right?
Wait a second. I'm really confused because the whole point is, right, if Islam will inherently generate an honor culture, right, and if the Jews have this strong tendency to generate a dignity culture, why is it the case that they lived side by side in relative peace before the political circumstances I'm talking about came about, right? It seems like those political circumstances have more emphasis than the culture that these people had previously. That's the point.
I'm not sure I agree with you on what the values are that these people held at the time. Like I said, if they had incompatible values at the time and they were coexisting, I would argue that it was in an extremely non-relativistic fashion. In other words, the Jews did act as if they were better or more right, so to speak, and that these Muslims were below them. But that's another topic, right? So I'd like to, I have this video that I only want to play a minute of so that he can explain the point better than I can, if that's fine.
I think we should just stay on that initial point for a second. Jonjon, okay, fine. Even if it was the case, yeah, and you're going to probably have to render the argument in the video, but even if it was the case, right, that the Jews saw themselves as better or the Muslims saw themselves as better, the whole point was, right, the tendency for conflict wasn't there. The whole point is that they weren't butchering and slaughtering one another. That, in large part, there may have been some kind of what's called social disagreements. I'm not saying that there weren't, but there wasn't mass conflict. There weren't people killing it one another, right?
Well, Sam, so I would argue that moral relativism is the devil in the details, so to speak. Here, like, moral relativism has a huge role to play on our attitudes towards our neighbors where we are coexisting with.
To be honest with you, I don't think that
moral relativism is.
I don't think
hold on. Are asserting their views in a much more dogmatic fashion than ever before.
I don't think talking about moral relativism is even viable here. Look, the people who lived in these territories at the time were mostly religious Jews and Muslims, who definitely were not moral relativists. And the vast majority of the people that occupy the Palestinian territories and the Israeli lands today are also religious. Christians and Jews, who are most likely are also religious Jews and Muslims, are probably not moral relativists. So I don't think moral relativism was a factor.
Well, you said probably. All right, that's not good enough for me.
Dude,
you don't know what you're talking about.
They're not. They weren't moral relativists.
Oh, now you switched it up. Oh, no.
Religious Muslims and Jews were not moral relativists. I can almost guarantee you that.
Okay, go ahead and play the video.
All right. Anyway, so Tasteless, do you want to do it for me? Because I'm on my phone. So
Yeah, sure.
if you just scroll up, go up, Tasteless. You see that video between Richard and Brett? It's like an hour and 11 minutes.
Yeah.
Like, play that on the bot and then fast forward it to 31 minutes, and we'll listen for like a minute or so. But hold on, let me
actually just render the argument in the video. Don't play a video in the
No.
First of all, thank you all for coming out and supporting it.
Fucking things.
I didn't.
He's allowed to. Yes, you Rich. Shut the fuck up. We're going to listen to.
No, wait. I didn't read anything.
Just let it happen. Just let it happen.
Go ahead.
So let me just add a few comments before the video plays for us. So keep in mind, my whole goal here was to show you guys and hope that you guys place much more credence in evolution, in the evolutionary sciences. I want you guys to understand that evolutionary biology explains human behavior very well, much more credit than you guys give. So we're gonna play a video where Brett Weinstein, an evolutionary biologist, is going to explain on an evolutionary scale the usefulness of suicide. And listen, this explains suicide killings within the Muslim community, right? I'm explaining the evolutionary characteristics that Islam produces, and this is just going to be another one of those things, right? So we're gonna hear an evolutionary biologist pretty much explain to us why it is suicide killings are arising in the Muslim culture. So if you want to, it's 31 minutes in. We'll listen for about a minute.
Okay, thanks, man. Yeah, play it, Yuri.
Yeah, it's the.
First of all, say thank you all for coming out and supporting intellectual discourse. It's so important. Please give yourselves a round of applause.
I think in principle, many of these things come back to the same couple of places where our field has instantiated a bad assumption. And so the assumption about individual selection, where lineage selection might be a more powerful concept, has caused us, I think, to miss the boat on all three of these characteristics. What I would say is, let's just take an example of the Middle East, for example. Let's say you have two populations in the Middle East, and both recognize that 500 years from now, they are not both likely to be there, that it is likely to be one or the other, but not both. Were that the case, then any fitness that was realized in the present day would be more or less meaningless if you were in the population that blinked out 200 years from now. So you would find a rational investment in behaviors that discounted individual fitness, prioritized lineage fitness. In other words, you would see extraordinary levels of self-sacrifice in the interest of ensuring that the population to which the individual doing the sacrifice belonged was the one that continued to exist. I don't know how clear that was, but the basic idea is, in extraordinary circumstances, like, for example, a piece of land that isn't getting any bigger and is fully inhabited and has competing lineages that cannot simply live peaceably together, that suicidal self-sacrifice might be rational. Now again, naturalistic fallacy being what it is, just because something is doesn't mean it ought to be, and I'm not defending it as a good thing, but I'm saying, can we understand it rationally? If we think about adaptation occurring at the lineage level, I think it's not hard to see cases where suicide, I mean, really it's one step past getting on a ship and going over the horizon to see if you can find a new landmass that nobody's discovered. That's a near suicidal behavior that's somewhat comprehensible. Actual suicide can make sense if the circumstances are extraordinary enough. And I would also say, closer to home, that if we look at cases where people commit suicide in our own culture, very frequently they are beset by the sense that they are beyond worthless, that they have no value, that their existence is...
that's enough, probably. All right, Jonjon, and what was that meant to demonstrate? Yeah, tie it back to the concept.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I've already explained it. My whole goal here is, like, first off, do you challenge anything that Brett said? Do you think that you know something he doesn't hear, or what?
I think what he said makes sense. It's just I'm not really sure how that goes about proving your point on this. I'm not really sure how it ties into providing the best explanation for the conflict.
Listen, he explained before he red pilled you on the suicides. He explained that he was talking about the Middle East, right, where Islam is running rampant. So you didn't really catch it, but he was absolutely getting at Islam and the Muslims, right? He was explaining why it is we see the suicide. He was explaining why it is suicide would be considered the rational thing to do, right? In other words, he's giving evolutionary based reasons for why Muslims are killing themselves in the name of their faith. It's because they have recognized there's not a future for them. There's not a place for them in the future. So they feel useless. They feel like they have no worth. So that's whenever it becomes rational to kill themselves in the name of their faith and make sure that they have a place in the future.
The problem with this conflict, the problem with that point actually is two things. One, the Israelis who are on the front lines of the conflict, or the Israelis who present the most problem in this case, are the most religious Israelis, right? So that criticism, like, something can't serve as evidence for and at the same time evidence against, right? At the same time, is it that the radical Palestinians who are most committed to their faith are the problem? Yeah, that probably is the case. The radical Jews are also the most committed to aggression as well. Those people, the vast majority of the settlers on the West Bank, are doing it out of biblical principles, or what they claim to be biblical principles, that they believe that God endowed them with that land. And the Likud party is providing financial incentive for these very religious Jews to move to that land. So the whole point is, right? Hold on. The whole point is that criticism would apply to both sides of the conflict. It's not only the case that the Muslims are going to various extremes in order to fulfill their to fulfill what they see as some kind of religiously inspired desire. The Jews are also perpetuating the same concern, and to a much larger extent than the Muslims.
Jonjon is saying.
Yeah, and a much larger. But the point is, much larger extent than the Muslims, right? So this isn't a criticism. Hold on, this isn't a criticism that would only apply to the Muslims, right? Go ahead.
Sam, the issue that we're going to have, this is the third time or second time I've brought this up, and I've explained it the same way every time. There's a fundamental flaw in your reasoning. You place too much credence on socio-economic factors versus evolutionary-based explanation. Now, you've already acknowledged that this entire debate is going to boil down to me putting forth an explanation to the conflict, you doing the same, and people weighing up which explanation has more influential explanatory value, or something like that, right?
No, the problem is, right, and tasteless.
Hold on, I'm not done yet.
Hold on, no, because in tasteless, you're an idiot, right? I didn't see the debate. The whole issue, right? The whole issue is that this is a criticism that applies to both sides, but we only see one side acting to the extreme. In other words, right, there has to be another factor explaining this, right? It's not begging the question, actually. It's not just, right? Hold on. It's not just based on their beliefs. They both have these religious tendencies, right? But the reason why the Israelis are acting to a much greater extent than the Muslims, right, is because of political circumstances. It's because of the case. It's because of the case that they want to continue to expand this the illegal settlement project. It's because it's the case that they get billions of dollars in American taxpayer money to facilitate that expansion. It does boil down to socioeconomics. The whole point of me illustrating that both sides have that belief tasteless is to show that it's not the distinguishing factor, right? And to show that it all comes down to socioeconomics. And no, I didn't beg the question, but describe how you think I did.
Well, you're just putting forth, like, this is the third time you did it. You're saying, well, it is more influential. It is more influential. You're not backing that up at all.
I'll tell you how I act. It is more influential.
Tell us how you're backing it up.
I'll tell you, because both sides, like that criticism that you brought up, is subject to both sides, right? But you see much different behavior from one side than the other. You see a much different outcome for one side than the other. So there are other factors at play, other factors that are more critical. In other words, if let's say we were in a situation that the Israelis were by and large peaceful, right, and the Muslims were the only ones blowing themselves up and attacking the Israelis, your explanation might serve to explain that. But we see similar beliefs for both sides in this case. But we see different outcomes. We see different strategies.
You don't see similar views on both sides. That is absurd.
Yeah, you do. Wait, have you spoken to, or have you?
Are deeply incompatible.
Wait a second. We do see similar beliefs on both sides. Have you
Do
seen?
You agree
Hold on.
These views are incompatible, Sam. Yes or no?
What views are incompatible? What are you talking about?
Muslim, Islamic values versus Judeo values or Christian values.
I don't think
things are incompatible.
I don't think as two distinct cultures they necessarily are, and we have evidence from history to suggest otherwise.
Well,
right?
that's why we can't have the dialogue. We disagree on things so dramatic like what.
But all I'm saying, I have empirical evidence to the contrary, right? We have evidence. It's specifically.
I'm claiming that your Muslim brothers and sisters hold views you don't even agree with, and I'm just claiming you're not being honest about any of that. Why don't you condemn your Muslim brothers and sisters?
I think we're trailing off the conversation. So you asked me, right?
No, we're not, Sam.
Hold on.
Talking about values and cultures, right? Values and cultures. Values being incompatible. We are not straying off topic.
Hold on. We are. Right? You asked me a direct question, right? Do I believe that Jewish cultures and Islamic cultures are inherently incompatible? And I don't believe that's the case, right? I mean, we have evidence to the contrary. Specifically, when we talk about Israel and Palestine, we have evidence of Jews and Muslims living together in the same communities, attending the same schools, attending the same institutions, right? Without extensive violence. So that just means their cultures are not necessarily incompatible. But it's the political implications, right? It's the division of border lines by the British. It's recognition by foreign powers. There are socio-economic factors at play that fuel the conflict.
That's the only thing that I'll grant you right there. You just said that there's socio-economical factors at play that fuel the conflict. That's correct. That's correct. You are right. Don't interrupt me. You just got done talking, right? That part is correct. The part that is incorrect, Sam, is your lack of ability to acknowledge the explanatory, the value of the evolutionary sciences in this arena, right? You just won't do it. And I've tested you many times and you failed every single time, right? I'm trying to figure out what side of the war you're on, right? Are you willing to condemn Sharia law? Are you willing to condemn Muslims' hatred of gay people and things like that? So far, you haven't shown me you're willing to do that. You haven't shown me you're willing to acknowledge you disagree with your Muslim brothers and sisters and the culture they're peddling, right?
We're trailing off the conflict again, right? What we're talking about is the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians.
I don't think you understand what I'm talking about then if you're just going to keep repeating that.
No, Jonjon, hold on, right? My views are completely independent. So, okay, fine, yeah. I condemn Sharia law, and I wouldn't like that. My fifis would be hurt. That has no bearing on the conversation. And I'm not saying, right, something like evolutionary biology provides no explanation.
You're acknowledging as we speak that there is not a culture.
Who's the moderator here?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, don't stop what we're talking.
The point is, my whole point is that there's not an honor culture you would want to live in. So stop white knighting the people pushing the honor cultures.
We're talking about the primary motivations behind this conflict, right? And all I'm trying to say is that appealing to the empirical evidence on the ground, appealing to the actions of the Israeli state, appealing to political border divisions, that offers us much more explanatory. That offers us an account that has more explanatory value than yours.
You failed to prove that. You failed to prove that many times.
No, actually, I haven't, right? Because when we talk
again, go ahead, rant. Go ahead, another 5-minute rant.
The reason why it has more explanatory power is because when we try to identify the periods of the greatest tension, or try to find the periods of the greatest amounts of conflict, those border divisions provide that explanation. In other words, right, previous to the 1948 division plan, there was more peace in the region. The Muslims and the Jews did live in similar communities, attended the same schools, went to the same hospitals and whatnot. Prior to the division, right, and the influx of Jews from Europe post 1948, that's what triggered the First War, right? And Israel annexing East Jerusalem in 1967, that's what triggered the Six-Day War. And what triggered the Palestinians resisting and what's called their intifada in like there were multiple intifadas, were always Israeli acts of aggression, like the white phosphorus attack that I talked about, right, where they used white phosphorus on the Gaza Strip. It just seems like appealing to these kinds of evidence, appealing to political border divisions, offers us the best account of the conflict, right? It's not just because they have two different cultures, because previously they had different cultures and different identities, and they existed without the same tendency of conflict that we see today. That's the argument.
We're gonna have to try to move forward in the dialogue, or maybe even like have closing discussion or closing statements, if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm fine with that being my closing statement.
So, I guess my closing statement's going to be something like, my opponent has begged the question many times and has put forth claims like socio-economic factors are more explanatory than the evolutionary factors. This is absolutely absurd, given the fact that I can absolutely ignore everything he said, all the socio-economic factors, and still provide reasons why we would see the conflict, the same conflict, right? So what he fails to understand is that evolutionary biology has more explanatory value than he puts off or he understands. The point of the video that I played was to show an evolutionary biologist backing what I'm saying up. He's explaining behavior we see in the Muslim world. He explained why it would be rational for people to kill themselves in the name of their faith, or selected for ideas that have been passed down, right? So what everyone needs to take away from the discussion is that evolutionary biology is fucking awesome, and it absolutely helps us understand human conflict and behavior on a level that a lot of people fail to understand.
Okay, that was good.
All right. I suppose we could put it up to a vote at this point.
Jonjon, do you think you were persuasive at all?
I think I solved the shit you guys have been debating for I don't even want to acknowledge how long. I solved the conflict.
Well, that's right. You didn't acknowledge almost anything that Sam said.
It was irrelevant, to be honest.
Why?
Because there are going
let's
to be...
imagine this. Imagine if it was chess. I was playing 4D chess because I was viewing and conceptualizing these issues on a far more deeper fundamental level, on an evolutionary level.
But
so it's like I was the lecturer and you guys were like just sitting down.